Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Why No One Plays. Today we'll be featuring Sona, the Maven of the Strings. If this is your first time watching Why No One Plays, I'd like to make a disclaimer that the series name is not meant to be taken literally. People do play Sona but not very often, and my goal is to raise more awareness of unpopular champions by analyzing why their gameplay or design doesn't appeal to those who don't play them. Also, before we begin, I'd like to give a shout out to the Sona main subreddit for help with information and insight for this episode, so I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Down in the bot lane, there's usually two types of supports present, enchanters and tanks. These two classes make up about 90% of the champions accompanying AD carries since they carry two sets of tools marksmen don't have, survivability and crowd control respectively. The third subcategory is mages, but generally speaking you don't see them all too often relative to the big two. The balance of power and popularity ebbs and flows between the two subclasses, as there's usually a 6 to 12 month period where tanks are really in the meta or enchanters, but for almost a year now, there has been a prevalence of tanks and playmaking supports, with champions like Nautilus, Leona, and Alistar to name a few, winning the lion's share of popularity down there for quite some time. Comparatively, there's a greater divide in pick rate consistency for enchanter supports because while Janna, Lulu, and Yuumi are still holding down the fort, we have others like Soraka, Zilean, and Sona who are only fielded a fraction of the time. In fact, Sona has experienced the worst of it for the past few years. She's never been the most sought after relative to others who routinely see 10 to 15% pick rates for several months, but ever since the end of the Ardent Sensor meta in late Season 7, she's never been able to get even close to double digits. Now, contrary to popular belief, Sona's fall from grace was not solely because of the release of Seraphine, whom the vast majority of the community see as an infinitely superior version of the former. She's been struggling long before, but Seraphine's release was the proverbial nail on the coffin that may as well have shattered any hopes of her coming back. Sona's gameplay has a simple premise but a lot of depth to it. She has 3 separate auras, of which only one can be active at a time based on what ability you use. Said aura gives a temporary buff to any ally within its radius. In a way, her design is not unlike that of Udyr, who has an active effect upon activating one of his 4 stances, then a persistent effect that lingers afterwards. So starting off with her Q, Hymn of Valor is her main damaging tool and the offensive aura of the 3. The active effect is an auto-targeted attack that damages the 2 nearest enemy units. For the aura effect, Sona and her teammates have their next basic attack empowered to deal bonus magic damage. Q is naturally her most spammable ability, but it also carries the lowest impact as all it effectively does is deal damage, nothing more. Aria of Perseverance is her main sustenance tool and the defensive aura of the 3. Instead of dealing damage, the active effect heals her and the most wounded nearby allied champion. As for the aura effect, she provides a shield to any champion tagged. Song of Celerity is her main utility tool and the enhancing aura of the 3. On cast, she gains a surge of movement speed that lasts longer if she's not in combat. And the aura effect provides a similar movement speed boost to her allies, though at a reduced amount. This ability is immaculate at increasing the overall tempo of her entire team, and can scale really well into the mid to late game when rotation speed matters more. It's these 3 abilities that make the fundamental essence of her gameplay, 3 different active functions and 3 different auras, basically being a watered down version of whatever the active effect is. But there's one more unique component present in her Q, W, and E thanks to her passive, Power Chord. Sona gains an empowered basic attack after casting 3 abilities, dealing bonus magic damage and applying an additional effect depending on the last ability used. If her 3rd ability was Hymn of Valor, the attack deals 40% more damage. If she used Aria of Perseverance, Power Chord will reduce the target's size and their damage output for 3 seconds, making her one of very few champions in the game who can actually do this. And lastly, Song of Celerity has the inverse effect of its active, slowing whoever she attacks for a couple seconds. Sona has a lot going for her in terms of the utility she brings to the table. She has damage, she has debuffs, she has shields, she has heals, she has movement speed, she has slows, etc. Yet in spite of all of her properties, there's one extremely crucial thing that her kit doesn't address. She's 100% neutral oriented, as in Sona physically cannot start anything for her team. Obviously this issue is shared with the vast majority of enchanters who are normally built to protect their allies instead of attacking enemies. But Sona has absolutely nothing in her kit that allows her to advance the game state outside of her ultimate, which isn't a primary engage tool either. Now to her credit, she has a very strong neutral game and can do a good job at preventing the enemy team from getting any headway because any damage her team suffers can be shielded and healed right back up since her abilities have low cooldowns in the mid to late game. She can speed up her teammates to help keep their distance away from any threats like assassins or tanks because the former requires an injured target who's out of position, while the latter has to be within distance. neither of which can be accomplished easily when Sona turns her whole team into Bear Stance Udyr while giving AoE shields and heals. But the blade cuts both ways. Even though she's really good at deterring the enemy team from gaining advantage, she herself is also really bad at gaining advantage for her team. This can lead to very stale gameplay for many players because it becomes a war of attrition, which naturally is really boring to play or watch. Crescendo is a very solid teamfight ultimate in and of itself for sure, but it suffers from Kennen syndrome where Sona can't use this to start a fight unless the enemy team face checks or someone else on her team starts the fight first. And while it is possible to flash ultimate to catch someone walking up a little too close, Flash is a universal summoner spell and not something only she has access to, so you can't really consider it a benefit. In essence, she's the most enchantery enchanter that ever enchanted. She literally only exists to help her team and can't do much on her own. Yes, there have been rare occasions when Sona top or Sona mid was a high win rate cheese strategy, but that's only by virtue of her having the easiest point and click harass in the game, as well as her items being super strong and her being overbuffed. Sona may lack a lot of the engage or disengage that her peers carry, but she makes up for it by being arguably the most consistent support in the game if we talk strictly utility. Taric may beat her out in terms of sheer amplification, but he can't come close to the output that Sona is able to provide her team. Thing is, she's sort of a solution searching for a problem, not the other way around. By being essentially one of the best steroids for her team, you willingly have to surrender personal agency to play this champion. That is, even though you make it much easier for your teammates to carry games, there's still other people, and in solo queue no one trusts anyone but themselves for better or worse. This isn't so much the fault of Sona's design as it is the player mentality that just runs rampant in League, but it's still a problem nonetheless. Sona, for all intents and purposes, would make a lot more sense in an RPG game much like Taric, because in a game like League of Legends, it's very hard for someone with her gameplay to solo carry games. Other enchanters like Janna, Lulu, Bard, Nami, and I suppose Seraphine all have ways they can impact a skirmish or a teamfight outside of their ultimates. Janna has her Tornado, Lulu has a Polymorph, Bard has a Stun, Nami has her Bubble, Seraphine has Beat Drop, and even if we were to make the case that Sona's ultimate is amazing for making plays, the same can be said for the other 5 champions. What's funny is that Sona typically averages a very high win rate, so it's not so much that she's a bad or weak champion, but her win rate is not conducive to her own performance. If we were to look at the 5 champions on a team contributing an individual 20% each, when you play Sona, you essentially give everyone on your team 5% plus a bonus 1% to make the other 4 champions have individual outputs of 26%, which is a net positive overall, but you yourself carry none of that pressure. You might be wondering why this is a bad thing because it doesn't matter how you win as long as you do win. I completely agree. But gambling your success or failure on people you've never met would not make any sense in the real world, so players don't want to take that chance in-game either, especially competitive games. Even if you super buff your teammates, that doesn't matter if your top laner is 0-6 and your jungler is 1-4. And that's partly the reason why so many players believe Seraphine is just infinitely better than Sona, because Seraphine has actual carry potential. Even though she doesn't have nearly the same buffing capabilities as Sona, she does just enough to protect and support her team while having better damage and crowd control. See, the issue with Sona is that it just doesn't matter how good she is at her job if there's no demand for that job. But if Riot buffs her too much, then she augments her team's stats so much to the point where even if she has 4 headless chickens, they can still win games. She's in a really weird spot where she can only be a popular solo queue champion if she's too strong and irrelevant otherwise. The biggest contributing factor to Sona's polarizing stats is due to the fact that she scales incredibly well into the mid to late game. All properties of her kit grow stronger the longer the game goes on for. Her damage increases, her healing increases, her movement speed increases, her shielding increases, her slow increases, her damage debuff increases, everything increases. Not to mention they can be used more frequently as their cooldown lowers. To offset this, Sona has a very weak early game and is far more reliant on items and levels than most other supports who can be useful right from the start. High mana costs, long cooldown, really low base numbers, and no safe way to disengage fights early on because she can't move very fast yet, nor does she have access to her ultimate. She's the only enchanter support in the game who doesn't have a fast-acting engaged deterrent. If you watch Why No One Plays Braum, I talk about just how important crowd control is in League of Legends because it can do basically everything. You can use it offensively or defensively if you like. Bard's Cosmic Binding, Janna's Howling Gale, Lulu's Whimsy, Seraphine's Beat Drop, Morgana's Dark Binding, Nami's Aqua Prison, Soraka's Equinox, Taric's Dazzle, Zillion's Time Bomb, everyone except I guess Yuumi has some way to make things harder for the enemy team to chase after you. And technically, Yuumi has a much stronger early game than Sona because she has higher base numbers. Not to mention, she goes untargetable, so you don't have to concern yourself with your own personal safety nearly as much. Lane priority has never been so important. We're in such a snowball-heavy League of Legends where 2v2s and 3v3s happen very often in the first 10 minutes of the game. And because Sona is so weak early on, bot lane priority will be practically non-existent for you and your ADC unless you play really well or the enemy bot lane is a walking dumpster fire. Sona is also one of the worst supports in the game to prevent tower dives without her ultimate, which does happen frequently ever since they made tower plates a thing. There's almost nothing she can do to stop a 3 or 4 man bot situation because all she can do is give her ADC more stats, but not enough to where they can 1v4. And she herself is extremely squishy and vulnerable to attack, so unless you're partnered up with someone like Xayah or Tristana who has their own self-peel, it's simply too risky to play her. Moreover, Sona faces the same issue as Taric, where she's really item dependent but has no easy way to get gold because she's a support. Putting it all together, the margin for error is really tight on her for the first 10 to 15 minutes of the game, and surviving until you have your core build usually comes down to whether or not you get hard camped or are allowed to have a quiet 2v2 lane. And lastly, this is something I don't think many people to bring to light enough, but hardly anyone actually knows just how good her passive is. Those who don't play Sona are quick to dismiss her as a weak face-rolling champion who spams Q, W, and E whenever available. But Power Chord is frankly underappreciated for how essential it is to properly master this champion. There will be situations where you have to decide which empowered basic attack to choose, and usually, players who pick up Sona for the first few games or so might misunderstand her to be very underwhelming because they're using the wrong Power Chord. As I mentioned before, Sona is one of the few champions in the game that can weaken her opponent's actual damage. She basically has the summoner spell Exhaust built into her kit. Timing Power Chord Diminuendo on a high priority assassin or diver can literally save your team's life, especially in the late game when damage reduction reaches close to 40%. The other two Power Chords aren't nearly as impactful but still come with their own utility. So few players appreciate Sona's passive because most of the time they don't even know it exists. She's actually a very difficult champion to play, perhaps the hardest enchanter in the game second to Zilean. It's due to the fact that apart from her other weaknesses, Power Chord is so inconspicuous. In a teamfight or skirmish, you have to sequence your abilities in a specific order to get the correct empowered auto attack and have it ready for when you absolutely need it the most. Timing your spells is paramount to pushing the limits of what you can do on Sona. It's similar to Udyr, where it feels so tempting to just face roll abilities, but you actually need to carefully keep track of how they're being used, not only to preserve mana but to get the most out of each one. It's also why a lot of people think Udyr is overpowered, but then they pick him up for the first time and feel useless on him. At a glance, Sona may seem like a really keyboard mashy champion, but she isn't. There's so much she can provide to her team, and in the hands of someone who really puts in the time and patience to master her, she can be one of the most reliable supports in the game. At the same time, she suffers from having a counterintuitive playstyle, especially in solo queue where everyone has anime main character syndrome. That and her early game can be absolute hell to go through. I still think it's such a shame that she's played so little because people think she's a weaker version of Seraphine. While I believe the latter has a lot more playmaking and carry potential, it's not fair to dismiss the former for what she can bring to the table. All the same, Sona needs to be reworked because in her current state, she's never gonna see the light of day again unless Riot either overbuffs her or changes her abilities to actually give personal agency to those who main her. Where she stands right now, she's basically a stat battery for other champions. If you enjoyed the video, a rating would be much appreciated, and if you'd like to see more content like this, consider subscribing to the channel. Also check out the video description down below for links to my Discord and social media, as well as a playlist containing all my Why No One Plays episodes if you'd like to watch more. Once again, I'd like to say thank you so much to the Sona Mains Reddit for helping me out with this video, but for now that's it for today. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you again soon for the next one. Take care.